Hello, my name is Tatiana Witt, and in this presentation, I speak about untangling the origins of the floating suprasegmental component in Nuer. In keeping with the theme of this panel, this talk is about investigations into a little documented language, and the phenomena, the origins of which the study aims to untangle, is of the suprasegmental nature, which makes it a tick more elusive than the segmental phenomena. I will talk about the benefits and the challenges of working with the little documented language encountered in the course of this study. And this talk is structured as follows. I will provide the language background, followed by the description of the phenomenon I investigated. I will then discuss the kinds of data that I used to study diachrony. And these include the synchronic data, the cognate data, and the written records. Nuer is a West Nilotic language spoken in South Sudan and Ethiopia within a rather sizable area of 166 square kilometers. And there is a considerable dialect variation, which is not fully understood at present. The Nuer phonology is notoriously complex. Here I will not go into the details as the issue is orthogonal to the present talk. I will, however, comment on some essentials relevant to the data that I will be presenting and on the principles I employed in transcription. First, there is a three-way vowel length contrast. Monophthongs and diphthongs can be phonemically short, long, or overlong. Second, there are three tonemes in Nuer, high, low, and mid, as well as various allotones such as the rise and the fall that we will see in the data. So the allotones are shown in the surface phonological representation between the square brackets. The tonemes are shown in the underlying representation without any brackets. So in addition to allotony, the contours could be due to a combination of level tones. And whenever possible, I signal this by placing two diacritics next to each other. And the floating suprasegmental component will be presented in the underlying representation using the Greek letter mu to signal that it contains a weight unit, mora. Let us now examine the phenomenon in question. Some Nuer nouns have a floating suprasegmental component abbreviated as FSC. FSC consists of a floating mora and a high tone that occur at the left edge of nouns. FSC is realized only with the addition of the preceding context. Examples in the table show the noun child that does not have FSC and the noun dog person, where dog being a name of a Nuer clan, and this noun has FSC. So when the two words are uttered in isolation, there is no, both are realized as monosyllabic. So there's FSC is not realized in this context. And I will play the sound files now.
Got, dog.
So the difference becomes apparent when the two words occur preceded by some context. And in this case, they're preceded by a short, low-toned suffix. And before the ordinary noun, the suffix vowel is short and low-toned. Before the noun with FSC, however, the vowel lengthens and there is a change in the tonal melody. And here are the waveforms and F0 traces of the nouns and the preceding context, preceding vowel. So we can see that there is a difference in duration. Before child, the vowel is 73 milliseconds, and before dog person, it is 111 milliseconds. And there is a change in F0 from level low to a rise. I will now play the files.
Hanana got, Hanana dog.
Again.
Hanana got, Hanana dog.
Of course, faced with a phenomenon like this, we would want to know about the origins of it. And one of the avenues of investigation in the study was the synchronic data. And that is the data that I collected with the Nuer speakers. And in what follows, I will describe the kinds of data used in the study. I will then talk about dialect variation and the benefits of working with a number of dialects. And lastly, I will speak about the challenges associated with the context in which the study was carried out, and namely, it was conducted among the Nuer diaspora outside of the native territories. For this study, I used two kinds of data, the elicited data and the recorded narratives. Now, saying that, most of the hypotheses were generated with the help of the elicited data, and the narratives were used to corroborate the analysis. So the elicited data was deemed superior in this research as it allowed me to collect tightly controlled data sets. In particular, I was interested in the effects of FSC on the preceding context. So I constructed a number of semantically and grammatically plausible sentences bearing the parameters in the context before the noun. So for example, there were closed and open syllables, preceding syllables, which had different tonal pattern. And for the open syllables, I also varied a vowel length. So the relevant data was also found in the narratives, as the sentence from The North Wind and the Sun story shows, where the low-toned vowel before the noun with FSC lengthens, and there is a change in the tonal melody. However, although the relevant data does occur in the recorded texts, it is not as exhaustive in terms of the preceding context as one would want it to be. So relying on this kind of data alone without having access to the speakers would have made the investigation to stretch out in time quite considerably. And that is only on the condition that there is a lot of recorded narrative data, which is not at all the case for Nuer. Now, here I will speak about my decisions for choosing to work with this or other dialects. Now, I started by working with the speakers of Eastern dialects, and here Eastern dialects of South Sudan are spoken close to Ethiopian border. And that is because I had access to these speakers. Now, at some point, it became clear that what I observed with the Eastern speakers differed from what has been described at the beginning of last century for the Western Nuer by a missionary, Father Kratzulara. Now, this prompted me to find speakers from the West. So, and once I started working with the Western speakers, it became clear that we cannot just speak of a Western dialect. Instead, there is a considerable variation between the speakers from different areas. And this motivated me to look for speakers from a number of areas within South Sudan. So far, I have identified 6 dialects, but it must be noted that I have not worked with speakers from all areas I wanted to check. So I estimate that there are around 16 different dialects of Nuer in South Sudan alone. And I hypothesize that the dialects follow the county system that is shown on this map here. And the reason for this rather neat arrangement is that the division into the counties is relatively recent. It occurred well after the South Sudanese independence in 2011, and the split into the counties reflects the division into Nuer clans. In addition to the dialect differences of the geographical nature, there are differences that relate to age groups. Now, for example, I investigated vowel lengthening due to FSC with a number of speakers from the same area. And the speakers who were in their 70s had considerably longer durations than the speakers in their 40s. So this suggests that the contrast is becoming smaller in the younger speakers. Now, here's a rather busy slide to show the benefits of working with a number of dialects rather than a single dialect. So we have here the data from 3 dialects, which I will call dialect 1, 2, and 3. For each, the same 2 sentences are given featuring our earlier word with FSC doc person. Now, it must be noted that the phonological composition of the noun differs depending on the dialect. It is dwa in dialect 1, doc in dialect 2, and dwak in dialect 3. But in all the 3 dialects, the word is monosyllabic. It has a short vowel and a low tone, and most importantly, it contains FSC, as is evident from the effect on the preceding context. So the preceding context shown in the table is 1, where the preceding context vowel is low-toned, and 2, where the preceding vowel is high-toned. And we can see that the dialects 1 and 2, the FSC triggers vowel lengthening in both of these contexts, whereas in dialect 3, vowel lengthening occurs only in context 1, the low-toned context, but not in the context 2, the high-toned context. With respect to tone, a change in tonal melody occurs in both contexts, in dialect 2, and only in the low tone context in the dialects 1 and 3. Now that I have given this super fast presentation of the rather complex data, I'm going to move to the analysis for each dialect, as this reveals something rather interesting. So the data from the dialects 1 and 2 is what led me to hypothesize that FSC consists of a floating mora and high tone, since there is evidence that both the mora and the high tone cross the word boundary to associate with the preceding syllable. There is a difference between the dialects, between 1 and 2, with respect to the tonal behavior, namely in context 2, tonal change occurs only in dialect 2 and not in dialect 1. And this is a phenomenon that I call dissimilatory lowering, where the second high in a sequence of 2 highs becomes low. So this process is attested in all Nuer dialects, but only in the dialect 2 in this particular context. Now, the dialect 3 is an outlier as far as the effects of the FSC on the preceding context are concerned. Namely, vowel lengthening and tone change occur only when the preceding context is low-toned, but not when it is high-toned. So the most economical analysis for this dialect is to assume that FSC consists of a floating high tone alone, and that in context 1, the vowel lengthens in order to accommodate the floating high tone. Now, dialect 3 is objectively an outlier, as suggested by the data from 6 Nuer dialects I worked with so far, whereas dialects 1 and 2 are representative of the majority. What is very interesting in all of this is that the Nuer orthography is based on the dialect 3, and for the reason no other than the American mission that developed the standard orthography in a course of Bible translation was stationed in the area of the dialect 3. And we will touch on the written data a little later, but this suggests that the written records can potentially be underrepresented. Now, one of the major challenges in my work with the Nuer community is the lack of access to the native territories. All of my work so far has been conducted with the speakers that either live abroad or in the South Sudanese capital, Juba. Although the first generation of the Nuer migrants tend to live within close-knit communities and attend Nuer medium churches, they do not stay within their dialect or clan groups, of course. And because of that, they're exposed to various Nuer dialects other than their own. And it is not uncommon for the speakers to lack inconsistency with respect to how they speak. And this is most relevant to the speakers from the West. So those dialects are saliently different from the rest of the dialects. And the modification is in favor of the dialects spoken in the East. And this could also be due to the fact that these speakers are literate and regularly read the Bible that is modeled on dialect 3, which is one of the Eastern dialects. And the younger Western speakers tend to be most inconsistent in this respect, suggesting that there is a tendency towards homogeneity among the younger population. Now, the next avenue of investigation was the cognate data. That is, of course, something that is used widely by the historical linguists. What differs in this case is that most of the data on West Nilotic languages is relatively recent. Now we know that Nuer is the only language within its sub-branch that lacks vowel initial nouns. And the table here shows the cognate data from 3 languages of the Dinka-Nuer sub-branch. And the cognates are those that have FSC in Nuer. Both Rel and Dinka have word initial vowel A in these words. Now, out of the 23 cognates with the word initial A in Dinka that I have checked, 22 had FSC in one of those Nuer dialects. And this leads me to hypothesize that FSC cognates, FSC originates from this vowel. Now, the absence of the vowel initial nouns in Nuer appears to be a relatively recent development. And this is because we know that Rel, the speakers of Rel, the language where the vowel is still intact, have separated from the Nuer some 500 years ago. We also know that this vowel was already absent in Nuer at the beginning of last century when a number of missionaries made linguistic records of Nuer. I therefore hypothesize that the vowel A was lost somewhere between 500 and 100 years ago. Now, the final avenue of investigation I explored was the written data. As previously mentioned, Nuer orthography was developed in the mid-20th century in the course of the Bible translation. It is based on the single dialect, our earlier dialect 3. With the dialect variation in the realms of phonology, morphology, and syntax, the orthography is not representative of many other Nuer dialects. In addition, tone is not represented in orthography, and vowel length is not adequately represented. So specifically, the contrast between the short and the long vowels does not tend to be represented. Now, however, it is rather amazing to see that the effects of FSC are in fact reflected to some degree in the standard orthography. Now, consider the text on the right that comes from a primer produced by SIL. Only one noun in the text has FSC. It is the noun lek, which is pestle. So the Nuer orthography captures vowel lengthening due to FSC in 2 low-toned function words, the preposition ke and the single copula e. Now, these are underlined in red here. Now, compare the spelling of those words in context before the nouns without FSC. So they're underlined in blue. So we can see that they're spelled with the single vowel grapheme. Now, lengthening occurs elsewhere, but is not captured by the Nuer orthography, as can be seen in the italicized example showing the orthography of our earliest sentence where FSC triggers vowel lengthening of the low tone suffix. Now, the question, of course, is why would the orthography reflect lengthening in some instances, but not in other? Well, recall that only the low-toned contexts are subject to lengthening in the dialect 3 on which the orthography is modeled. I hypothesize that the orthography reflects only the stable low-tone contexts. So lengthening is reflected only in the stable low tone context. So the two function words are always low tones, and as such, they always lengthen in dialect 2, in dialect 3, with the addition of FSC. Now, suffixes, as we saw earlier, can be either high toned or low toned. And as such, lengthening in suffixes does not occur consistently in dialect 3. And this is likely to be the reason why the standard orthography does not reflect lengthening in suffixes. Now, overall, it is rather telling that the contrast is represented at all, since the contrast between the short and the long vowels tend to be not represented. And this tells us that the phenomenon is salient enough to be reflected in the orthography. Now, in this presentation, I have shown that the hypothesis about the historical origins of FSC in Nuer grew out of traditional approaches employed by historical linguists, that is, I worked with the cognate West Nilotic data, and in addition, my work was informed by working towards description of Nuer dialects. And with respect to 2, I find that much like the cognate data, the dialect data shows us a bigger picture about the phenomena we investigate and unravels things that we would not be able to see if only looking at a single dialect, or what's worse, a dialect. In other words, studying dialect variation in Nuer dialects gives us a more representative picture of the phenomena under study. A lesson learned is that although in this case, the written record confirms the presence of FSC, it is underrepresentative of the phenomenon, and it is based on the outlier dialect. And this raises a question of how much faith we should place in written records in general. I also spoke about the tendency towards homogeneity in the diaspora and the migrant community. This homogeneity is likely to be also prompted by the standard Nuer orthography. Because there is a tendency to do away with the salient dialect features, I would say that it is best to conduct research in native territories for speakers who do not have, who didn't travel extensively or and are illiterate. Finally, I hope that I was able to convince you that it is entirely possible to conduct a study into the historical origins of the linguistic phenomena in a little documented language.